One of the recurring themes throughout all of Butler's work is that what makes you unique is often a blessing when you learn to control it, but a curse if you don't. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I get to talk to you about the work of Octavia E. Butler. These books are brought to us not only from Library of America, which recognized Octavia E. Butler's contribution to American letters long ago and are continuing to bring out her complete works, but also by one of my favorite presses of late, Seven Stories Press. These beautiful editions of the parable novels and most recently Bloodchild and Other Stories, and also two essays, and an introduction by Jesmyn Ward and the original preface from Butler herself, and an afterword to each piece in this newest publication of Butler's work from Seven Stories Press. Seven Stories Press is also very, very lucky to have been publishing the work of Annie Ernaux, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and her books immediately went out of stock after that happened. But Seven Stories has put available the unboxed set of all of their publications of Ernaux's work. As a part of this video, I'm also going to be doing a giveaway of Parable of the Sower and Bloodchild and Other Stories, the latest publication again from Seven Stories Press. So all you have to do to enter is just comment below and make sure that when I click on your YouTube name or when I go to respond to you there to your comment here on the video that you are ready to receive it here in a week or two. I will go and randomly select someone from the comment section letting you know that you've won, and then we'll get in touch about shipping information. This is open to anyone in the world. I don't talk about genre fiction much on this channel, and of genre fiction, sci-fi is probably my weakest, or maybe romance is probably the absolute weakest. But I have read a lot of horror. Back in my teenage and early 20s, I lapped up horror novels, and as part of that, I came into contact with a handful of vampire tales, specifically Richard Lehman, Bite, The Traveling Vampire Show, of course the classic Bram Stoker's Dracula, Salem's Lot from Stephen King, the Swedish writer Jan Arvid Lindqvist, I think his name is, who wrote Let the Right One In. And come to find out, of the three books that I read of Butler's for this video, one of them is Fledgling, which happens to not only be a vampire tale, but it introduces into the literary canon the first Black female vampire. Butler herself was at the vanguard of Black women writers, Black writers, and furthermore women writers, especially in her genre of science fiction, which was dominated, of course, by white males. And then, goodness, Butler comes along and just dominates with these incredible stories. She has such a wild imagination and such a dedication to and hunger for knowledge outside of just fiction writing, knowledge especially in biology and genetics, environmentalism. Like most great science fiction tales, she begins with a compelling what-if case and then just is off and running. I have to also plug Pauline Hopkins, who was the first Black female horror writer. Her book Of One Blood is out in this handsome paperback in a collection called The Haunted Library of Horror Classics and is presented to us from the Horror Writers Association. The more I've listened to interviews, read interviews, looked at some of her archives there at Huntington College in California, the more I'm just completely charmed and overcome by her warmth and confidence and charisma. There's this one photo of a notebook that's in her archives that I think is available through a posting on the Paris Review. But you can see where Butler has handwritten these declarations that she will be a best-selling novelist. She will be on the New York Times bestseller list. She will be read by millions. And furthermore, she will help minorities to get into writing workshops and to get their stories out there. She was very committed to this. And according to her friend Nisi Shaw, in conversation with the folks at Library of America, Shaw said that Butler was very much aware of her impact as a Black female sci-fi writer, and she loved it. And she used it to the good of so many others. I guess what I'm saying is that she's just a great person, and one of those writers that I think will inspire any of us who have any kind of desire to write at all. The more you read and find out about Octavia Butler, the more inspired and enthusiastic you'll become, because here's a person who knows exactly what she wants to do with her writing and just goes after it. And her joy in life was found in the writing itself, and that shows in everything that I've read. And by the way, these are just beautiful volumes. The design of these books is so compelling, so spectacular. I have the boxed set of the two Parable novels. There was supposed to be a third, but that never came to fruition because Butler's life was sadly and early truncated. But even for Fledgling, Seven Stories Press has given us this beautiful slipcase. In any case, let's go on with the show. The very first book that I read in preparation for this video was Parable of the Talents. This is probably her most popular, her most well-known, the one that kind of stands out there at the forefront, though in my opinion, it's not the best of what's out there. In fact, I'll just go ahead and tell you that I think Butler operates at her highest capacity, and she's most intense and impactful in her short fiction, which is really ironic because her preface to Bloodchild and Other Stories begins with basically, I hate writing short fiction. Nonetheless, this is a dystopian vision of a cruel, violent, desperate world where water is scarce, communities are walled off, and you don't go out unless you're in a group and armed. And, you know, when I was writing that out, I also made a note that these dystopian vision novels are a very, very overcrowded space now. This book came out in 1993, so it wasn't quite as overcrowded, but now in 2023, it's a very crowded space. And especially when you throw in TV and movies as well. The protagonist is a 15-year-old Black girl whose name is Lauren Olamina, and she has what's called in the book hyper-empathy. So within this cruel world where the worst of human behavior is at full tilt, Butler drops in this 15-year-old vulnerable, innocent, sweet girl who happens to have a condition where she is hyper empathetic to both pleasure and pain. And so it's really interesting. She can feel and even experience the pleasure and the pain of others. At first, when this is introduced to us, I thought, okay, this is going to be really interesting, especially in such a violent world. And then I realized that rape specifically is very heavy over the novel. We never get a scene of detailed graphic rape, which I'm thankful for because that's one of the things that disturbs me beyond many, many other things. But I realized that when you introduce a character such as Lauren, who hyper empathizes to the point that they experience another person's pleasure and pain, this really presents a strong and, dare I say, interesting conflict in the context of rape, because you're being assaulted, completely violated in a painful and violent way. Yet because of your condition, if your rapist is getting pleasure out of it, you're also experiencing that pleasure. I was surprised that by the time I got to the end of at least this first book of the Parable trilogy, which again is cut short, this never happens. We're never given this up front. And from what I recall, it doesn't happen off screen either. So it's really interesting that the thought was just put there, but it wasn't actually expanded upon. Maybe it was, again, in the Parable of the Talents. I haven't read that yet. Or it was planned for the third one that never came to fruition. This is the kind of stuff that is pure Butler-esque. These interesting parameters then put in this sort of laboratory, this experimental laboratory of her books. But aside from rape, if you flip it the other way around, it presents a really interesting situation if Lauren needs to kill somebody, which is highly probable in the world of this novel. Another thing that I found interesting is that this is written in a very isolated fashion. It's written in the first person by Lauren's journal entries. So that's all we get access to for this world. Yet the context demands group thinking. The context of their survival depends on group thinking. So that was a really interesting tension that Butler designed there. One of many tensions, some of which come from ageism, the urgency and exuberance of youth versus the patience and wisdom of old age, race, gender, economic stability. And you can hear Butler speaking through Lauren when Lauren utters such cries to her journal as, "I have to write. I don't know what else to do." What makes this book work best for me, though, is that Lauren happens to also be developing her own Weltanschauung, worldview, through scripture that she calls earthseed, and this notion that God and change are exactly the same thing, and that change is constantly shaping us. Therefore, God is constantly shaping us. Therefore, we can shape change and, ipso facto, shape God. These scriptures are all throughout the book as she's journaling them and putting them together as this new Bible for the generations to come. The earth is quickly becoming untenable for the human species, and Lauren, this prophet, has seen that if mankind is to survive through earthseed, they must take root within the stars. It's really a beautiful layer and dimension that makes this book stand apart from the average dystopian fare. Like Octavia E. Butler herself, Lauren Olamina is dedicated to changing the world around her. The next book I read was the vampire tale, Fledgling. And in fact, according to Butler herself, this was her fun novel. She had a blast writing this novel. And according to Nisi Shaw, Butler's friend and the contributor of an introduction to this 7 Stories Press hardcover, this was to be the first of a series. And Butler was very excited to continue on with it, but then sadly this would be her last published novel. In Fledgling, we have a young black girl who awakens in a cave and tries to piece together who she is and why she came to be where she is. She finds that her bite and licking of wounds is so pleasurable for the target that it makes her victims her slaves, essentially. She comes to know later that her name is actually Shori, and she's a something like 53 or 56-year-old vampire, and she's part of a species called the Ina. Furthermore, she is a product of eugenics, and like I said earlier, this is where we get the first black vampire in literature. Interestingly, the different parameters that Butler designed in this novel are flipping the script, so to speak, such that what is usually a disadvantage is here in this world an advantage. For example, Shori's dark skin, the melanin in her skin, gives her an advantage over all the other vampires because she can actually tolerate daylight to a certain extent. Shori makes slaves out of white people. Shori takes multiple partners, what are called symbionts here in this semiotic relationship, where when she decides that she wants to make someone her symbiont, or really, in a way, her slave. But it's more of a partnership. She gathers multiple partners, both male and female, that she sort of presides over. So I couldn't help but think of the Mormon style of polygamy, where you've got a guy with all these wives. But here, the script is completely flipped to where you have a matriarchy. And indeed, the Ina people are a matriarchal people. The women are the ones who are more potent and compete for males. All of these parameters and cases are utilized in the way that Butler is just so good at, with putting these characters in these situations and just sort of almost sitting back and observing how they react. And the typical reactions are here. She can get into the psychology of these different symbionts, whether male, female, black, white, young, old, whatever. I will say that the pace of this novel is so blisteringly fast that it can be hard sometimes to develop emotions, or to let your emotions about what's going on completely develop and open up. There's a lot more focus on sexual politics in this novel than the parable of the Sower or the short stories in Bloodchild. And at first brush, there are a lot of different provocations that could potentially turn readers off, especially in thinking about child molestation, incest, polygamy. But I urge you to stick with it, because you'll quickly find that some of the things you think are happening, especially right at the beginning, are not as they seem, and they'll be revealed to you. And you experience it thus the same way that the characters are experiencing their revelations. And the sexual politics are done in such an interesting way that just get you thinking, better than most nonfiction. The vampires, for example, cannot survive without their symbionts, and their symbionts cannot survive without them. So once the bite takes place, it can appear that through the free will of the vampire, they have robbed and canceled out the free will of the symbiont, the bite victim, so that now the symbiont is essentially a slave who is, through this chemical transference, now completely dedicated to their vampire, whether they want to be or not. But really, both are giving up their will to enter into this sort of chemical contract instead of a social contract, as Rousseau would have it. It really gets you thinking about the ethics of this symbiotic relationship with a vampire and all their many symbionts. And finally, I read Bloodchild and Other Stories. This one has an introduction by Jesmyn Ward. I think I failed to mention, but the Parable of the Sower has an introduction by none other than Gloria Steinem. And like I said, I think it's this collection of short stories that shines best for me out of what I've read from Octavia E. Butler. I highly, highly encourage you to get your hands on this collection from 7 stories and give it a shot. If you like it, you can go on to the novels. Within the first few pages of every story in here, and by the way, there are 5 stories, 2 short biographical essays, and then 2 more recent stories. But within the first few pages of every story, I absolutely had to read the rest of it. I could not toss it aside. One of the recurring themes throughout all of Butler's work is that what makes you unique is often a blessing when you learn to control it, but a curse if you don't. Also, one problem is often solved only to present another unforeseen problem or problems. And so there's this theme of learning to take control of who you are, especially of who you are, is seen through the eyes of society as at a disadvantage or a minority. Like I said, every story operates on this what if. For example, Bloodchild, what if humans made it to a new inhabitable planet only to find that the local dominant species considered us best utilized for incubating their offspring? In the evening and the morning and the night, she questions, what if a breakthrough miracle drug cured cancer, but spawned a disease that trickled down the family line that caused its victims to become obsessed with self-mutilation? In Near of Kin, which Octavia Butler has in her afterword a declaration that it has nothing to do with Kindred, her novel that's now made popular by the Hulu miniseries. I haven't read the novel or seen the series. But Near of Kin is a brief vignette about a girl finding out a buried truth about her parents. And the inspiration for this came from the Bible. And I love in the afterword how she's talking about the biblical inspiration of the story, but Butler says, "This was, of course, not exactly what my mother had in mind when she encouraged me to read the Bible." In Speech Sounds, which is probably my second favorite story in this collection, she questions, what if we lost the ability to communicate with one another verbally? What would it be like if we lost our literacy? In Crossover, we have an ultra short ramble in a drunk's life, and I didn't find it very compelling. In Amnesty, the one of the two newer stories, what if an alien species came to Earth and took over the economy, forcing us to be at their mercy to get jobs? This story really explored territory that put me in the mind of Ted Chiang's The Arrival, but Butler pushes it beyond just coming up with an interspecies lingua franca. And finally, in the Book of Martha, she questions, if God gave you some of his power to make one change on earth, what choice would you make? And I hope it's clear just from those what if statements that I derived from the stories that Butler has a mind that was perfectly suited to this craft of science fiction for the masses. Science fiction, like satire, seems to me to project the ills of society and the issues in our lives and on our planet because of its very hyperbole or speculation, taking things to their extremes and appealing to our emotions as well as our minds. This does such a great job at seizing our attention and getting us to really think about what's really going on in the world and about the truth of our default human nature and our behavior patterns when put in dire circumstances. In the afterword to one of her stories in the Bloodchild collection, Butler says that she often would start a story or a novel in a sort of depression or despair over the human race and our selfishness and our greed, only to be inspired again and to take heart again and have hope again in humanity by the end of her work. And so to sum up the work of Octavia E. Butler for this video, I would say that in the literature of Octavia E. Butler, there is a strong, intense urge to bridge the gap between strangers and bring us together.